So I'm going to open this special seminar. I want to acknowledge that I'm here at the Meanjin in Brisbane on Turrbal Yagara country on the last week in September. And it's a beautiful overcast day, which means showers and refreshments. As the co-director of the Molly Centre, we feel really honoured to welcome Professor Roianne West to share her wisdom and insights this morning. And just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're, as a participant, can you just put yourself on mute? If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll be taking note of them and sending them, referring them back to Roy at the end of the presentation. I think that's about it. Have fun. And I was thinking about how do I introduce Professor Roianne West? And we both, her and I were having a giggle. We think, oh, you know, what happens on a road trip stays on a road trip. And all those memories and friendships that I really treasure with Roy, what I know is Roy is an inspirational, solid Black woman who is staunch, who is fierce, who is very visionary in her approach. In one basketball, she was quite a athletic basketball player, that in one grand final, she got 11 three-pointers. This is now 20 years later, she's had knee reconstruction. So we hold on to those memories quite dearly. But I know, in the presence of Roianne, she's uplifting, she's inspirational, she's staunch, and there's no mucking around. And her presentation will clearly outline why she's one of Australia's front and forward thinkers and how we can make and improve the outcomes for our people. So on that note, Roy, thank you for joining us and we look forward to your presentation.
Lovely. Thank you, Yvette. What an introduction. No pressure. It's actually an honour to be here. The Birthing in Our Community project is one that I'm very proud to be affiliated with. Today's presentation is about the component of that program that relates to workforce, but specifically to Indigenous nurses and midwives, as it says in the title. My name is Roianne. I hope that I get an opportunity at the end to have a bit of a yarn with everybody here just about the presentation. I'm trying to move forward and it's not letting me, guys. Have I frozen it from my end? Technical issue on slide 1. There we go. All right, so I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose lands I'm sitting. I'm fortunate enough to be sitting on beautiful Quandamooka country out in Wynnum, which also happens to be my great-great-grandmother's country, great-granny Dungu, who's a Nugi woman from West Moreton. But we were very much born and raised Kalkadoon on my grandmother's country out of northwest Queensland where Mount Isa now resides. And I acknowledge each of you and I acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country, your traditional owners and the traditional owners on whose countries you're joining us for this presentation. My name is Roianne, as I stated. This is my family or my immediate family that I have here. So I'm a sister, a mother, and in the last 2 years I've become a grandmother of 3 beautiful grandchildren who absolutely light up my life and have changed my life. I was pretty passionate about Aboriginal health before I became a grandmother, but since becoming a grandmother didn't think it was possible, doubly passionate about ensuring that my children and my grandchildren have the same life opportunities as non-Indigenous kids in this country. Throughout this presentation, you'll see my grandchildren. Phoenix is the eldest, Ruby and baby Ivor, as well as my twin daughters, Taylor and Tyler, one who's studying nursing and the other who's studying midwifery. And Taylor and Tyler will be the 5th generation in our family to do nursing and or midwifery. Also have a mother who's been an Aboriginal health worker for just on 4 decades and recently retired. So Aboriginal health, nursing and midwifery is more than a job for us. It's a legacy and it's something our whole family is committed to. So I actually presented at an Australian College of Midwives conference in 2015, and I shared the link to that ACM conference. That was the theme for that conference was Super Midwives. It was on the Gold Coast. And the reason why I shared that presentation was because that presentation was very much about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, education and cultural safety in maternity services. So just for anyone that was interested in that aspect of maternity services, because today's presentation is about Indigenous nursing and midwifery, midwives within the maternity services. And although that presentation was in 2015, the key messages for that presentation very much have relevance today, which is a good thing and a bad thing, because those key messages were also what our leaders and our elders and now our ancestors were saying many, many decades ago. And certainly my commitment, having a set of twin daughters coming up directly behind me, as well as grandchildren coming up behind me, is to ensure that we progress this conversation further than when I inherited it off my old people and off Indigenous nursing and midwifery leaders. So the challenges that lie before us, and I'm sure I'm not telling anyone who's joining us today anything new, is that the birth rate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies is much greater than the wider population. One of our challenges in some communities is teenage pregnancies, whereas other communities that's not a challenge at all. That's a very accepted way of being in some communities. The other clinical challenges that we're dealing with is the higher rates of low birth weight babies, the higher rates of smoking during pregnancy, and the higher rates of infant mortality during pregnancy and the premature birth weight. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those statistics, because I'm assuming that everyone who's joining us today is joining us because of their passion about wanting to change these outcomes. So the presentation today is about the role of Indigenous knowledge in this space. And the reason why I've included the link to the other presentation around cultural safety and Aboriginal health education is because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives only make up for such a small percentage of the nursing and midwifery workforce. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the statistics, but unfortunately we only make up for 1.3% of the nursing and midwifery workforce. When I reflect on my 25 years in Aboriginal health and nursing and midwifery, added onto my mother's 40 years in Aboriginal health and nursing and midwifery, and my twin sister's 30 years and my brother's 25 years, collectively we have about 150 years of working in Aboriginal health and nursing and midwifery. A lot of our work, whether deliberately or not, has gone in building the capacity of the non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce. And that is really important to do, but not at the detriment of building the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, nursing and midwifery workforce. Both of these things need to be working simultaneously and not one over the other. So there's a really big challenge for us to actually balance that out and ensure that we're investing as much intellect and knowledge into building the Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce, and not only the numbers but the capability within that workforce as we are in building our non-Indigenous nurses and midwives as well. So I'll share some statistics about our Indigenous midwifery workforce in Australia today, including the clinical areas that we're working with the intent of demonstrating the challenge that lie ahead for all of us. So declaration, I'm not a midwife. I've been a registered nurse for just over 20 years now. My introduction into midwifery was, first and foremost, as a mum, delivering twins. I have 3 children of my own, a son who's 28, a set of twins that are 23, and then the absolute privilege of being there for the birth of 2 out of 3 of my grandchildren, and actually cutting the cord for my only granddaughter, Ruby Roianne. Outside of that, in my professional role, I was introduced into midwifery when I was the nursing director, one of Australia's first nursing directors for Aboriginal health at the then Townsville Hospital. That was a district before it became a HHS. And in that HHS at that time, it had approximately 25 nursing directors that sat down different institutes. And my role, as with most Indigenous leadership roles, is to sit across both vertically and horizontally within health services. And of course you can imagine how challenging that role is, given the complexity of care that's provided by tertiary hospitals. So my thinking is that I needed to align my leadership as a nursing director with the closing the gap key priority areas, which at that time was 5 of the 8 related to mothers and babies. At that time that I was starting to sort of strategize on how best I was going to get impacts for our people that coming through, being serviced through the Townsville Hospital and Health Service, Griffith University commenced the Bachelor of Midwifery program down at the Logan campus, and they were looking for a regional site. So it was purely synchronicity that I was introduced to Griffith University and the Bachelor of Midwifery program. And out of the Townsville Hospital, we led, I think it may have been about the second Indigenous cohort of Indigenous midwives. What was really phenomenal about that program is the expressions of interest come from approximately 25 Aboriginal women, a majority of those that were Aboriginal health workers, liaison officers, child and maternal health workers. And I had the job of supporting these ladies in mapping or applying for credit or recognition or prior learning to come into the Bachelor of Midwifery. And this was particularly challenging for me because we often talk about pathways within Indigenous workforce, but what I witnessed through that experiences was not pathways, it was actually roundabouts. So we had a whole cohort of Aboriginal health workers that had done multiple Cert 2, Cert 3, Cert 4s that were still earning the same salary and that was still in the same role. And this wasn't in a number of years, this was across decades. And although we wanted Aboriginal midwives because of the Indigenous knowledge and the lived experience that they bring to work with Indigenous mothers, that was not considered credit within a Bachelor of Midwifery. So working with what we got, unfortunately, the health workers were only eligible for 1 to 2 subjects. So even though they'd done hundreds of hours of working in primary health care and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, they were from the community, they were raised in the community, they had the same lived experiences working with their mothers, the recognition of the Indigenous knowledge that they brought just wasn't there. So that's the first area that I highlight as a challenge for us going forward, is to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is recognised both within nursing and midwifery disciplines. The second thing that I witnessed is that these health workers that were, for most of their career, marginalised, and a lot of ambiguity around what their roles were within an acute and secondary care setting. Once they become transitioned from being an Aboriginal health worker in a hospital setting or a maternal child health worker into being a midwifery cadet, it completely eliminated the ambiguity because the midwifery workforce knew how to work with a midwifery student or a midwifery cadet. There was very clear roles and responsibilities and a scope of practice. However, there was not that clarity with Aboriginal health workers, unfortunately, or with Aboriginal maternal or infant health workers. So that's our second challenge, because I don't promote and say that we need more Aboriginal nurses and midwives because we want to replace the health workers. Absolutely not. And if a mother who's been a health worker for 40 years, she'd give me a good clip under the ear if I was even starting to go down that path. Promoting the role of an Aboriginal nurse and a midwife, because an Aboriginal nurse and a midwife is not confused about the role of an Aboriginal health worker. The Aboriginal health worker role was conceptualised in the early 1960s as an act to increase access for Aboriginal people into our health services. So I'll just repeat that again. Aboriginal nurses and midwives are not there to replace Aboriginal health workers, maternal and infant health workers, or any of those roles. They're there because Aboriginal health workers, nurses and midwives do not have any confusion about the role or the scope of practice for an Aboriginal health worker. And that's often a confusion that people think if you've got an Aboriginal nurse or midwife that you don't need an Aboriginal health worker. The other confusion is when we get Aboriginal nurses and midwives, we see them as a number rather than developing models of care that can use the Indigenous knowledge that an Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce comes from. So some of the things I hear from our workforce is their non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery colleagues saying to leave their culture at the door, that their Aboriginality has nothing to do with this. So what I'm starting to highlight is, as we embark on this journey, is that there's a number of multitude of challenges that we need to be dealing with at the same time to ensure that when Aboriginal nurses and midwives are starting programs, that we increase their likelihood of success by simultaneously dealing with all of these issues that I'm chatting about now. So one of the papers I'm most proud of is highlighted here on the left-hand side, and it's called She Knows How We Feel. In this paper, I actually interviewed Aboriginal mothers who had their babies birthed by the Aboriginal midwifery students, and it is one of the most beautiful papers I have ever written. The second paper I'm drawing your attention to is when I transitioned from the hospital setting over into the Foundation Professor of Nursing at Griffith University, that I was adamant about measuring the impact of all of this work that we're doing in Aboriginal health and cultural safety training. So prior to starting at Griffith in 2015, and this is where I got to introduce to Professor Yvette Rowe, is Yvette and I were leading a discrete Aboriginal health course at a regional university that caused significant trauma, not only for the teaching team or the Indigenous students within that course, but the non-Indigenous students within that course as well. So after moving away from that experience, I was adamant I was never going to go back to it. However, in 2015, I ended up back in that situation again. And I jumped in to lead, and this is how I know Nikita Wiley, is to actually lead the discrete Indigenous health course at Griffith University. And that course serviced 23 of the undergraduate health professions at that university, one of the biggest faculties that there was. So I was adamant that if I was going to do this, that we're going to make sure that we're measuring the impact of that course on the students' learning. So we were one of the first universities nationally to apply the Department of Health endorsed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health curriculum framework. And out of that, we designed, developed and validated a tool to measure cultural capability, which is a self-assessment by students that was deployed both pre and post the discrete Indigenous health course. So that was, that I'm very proud to say, was initially piloted with a cohort of midwifery students. What I'll tell you about that tool is we've now been using that tool for 7 years in a multitude of different professions, and we're at the point now where we've got longitudinal data where we're actually doing comparisons between professions. So between midwifery, nursing, medicine and allied health. And midwifery is off the scale. So midwifery, it is, and this is why we don't only need to be looking at health professionals, we now need to be looking at the cultural characteristics of a particular profession. So why is midwifery much more, got higher scores post an Indigenous health innovation than what nursing has? Because nursing, as a proud nurse, unfortunately flatlined across the 7 years, whereas midwifery increases. So there's something about midwifery, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my next slides. I also had the privilege of working on a paper that measured the impact of caseload care that's been led by Indigenous midwives. And that was a very exciting paper for me to lead as well, is to be able to demonstrate the value of Indigenous knowledge in Indigenous-led midwifery models of care. The other piece of work I wanted to draw your attention on, and why I talked about this, that there's not one single approach that's going to make a difference in workforce. It needs to be a very multi-pronged approach, is that I supervised a non-Indigenous midwifery academic that also developed a tool to measure the impact of awareness of cultural safety pre and post, and innovation around building cultural safety of academics. So doing all the work around building the cultural safety of a student cohort is insignificant if you're not also building the cultural safety of your academic workforce, and that is insignificant if you're not building the cultural safety of the schools of nursing and midwifery, and that is insignificant if you're not building the cultural safety of nursing and midwifery as professions in this country, and that is insignificant if you're not looking at the cultural safety of the institutions within both of these professions actually work. So there's multiple levels there that need to be considered. Otherwise, the other ones are not sustainable. You may get small gains for a small amount of time, but unless you've got a really sophisticated approach to the multiple levels, you unfortunately won't get the gains that we need. And the evidence is telling us that we're not getting the gains that we need or that our people actually require. So what I'm showing you here in part of my work over the last couple of years is a bit of a genealogy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workforce in particular. So what I'm demonstrating very clearly is that in 1788, is that we had health and well-being and we had traditional healers, and we still have all of that in society today, contrary to what most people think. It was in 1788 that we had invasion and colonisation, but it's those parts in green that I wanted to draw your attention to. It was in 1988 that cultural safety movement began in New Zealand, and it was actually, and that was when Irahapati Ramsden provided a keynote at the Katsun conference. But I've just learnt recently that Dr. Ramsden also keynoted at a Kurana conference as well as the Australian College of Nurses conference in the years preceding the Katsun conference. So Australia's nursing and midwifery was really thinking about culturally safe nursing and midwifery care in about the early 1980s, about the same time that Irahapati Ramsden started to conceptualise what this means. But what's important about cultural safety is everyone thinks that Ramsden's work was about the cultural safety of nursing and midwifery workforce, of which it absolutely was. But the primary purpose of Ramsden's work, and again this is to do with the numbers, was about increasing the Māori workforce to be able to work with the Māori people. And part of increasing the Māori workforce, the nursing and midwifery workforce, was about building the cultural safety of the non-Māori nursing and midwifery workforce, because their attitudes were impacting on our ability to increase Indigenous nurses and midwives. So interrelated but separate, two separate issues. And what's often forgotten about Ramsden's work is the fact that the primary purpose was about increasing Indigenous nurses, Māori nurses and midwives to improve Māori health outcomes. A Māori nurse about workplace health and said, can I use that, and started to conceptualise what cultural safety was about.
Roy, I just want to interrupt. Can you go back 1 minute? You were just buffeting, and I think there was a key point you were saying about her work that got lost. It was buffeting a bit. So
okay,
just about her focus of her work and taking that work forward. You were just buffeting a bit.
Yeah, so the primary focus of Ramsden's work was about increasing the Māori nurses and midwives, because she believed that more Māori nurses and midwives were the best place to be able to improve Māori health outcomes. However, the issue that was impacting on the increasing of the Māori nursing and midwifery workforce was the cultural safety of the non-Māori nursing and midwifery workforce. So you can see, when you turn your attention to the non-Māori nursing and midwifery workforce, a lot of the conversation about cultural safety has been around 97% of the workforce, and not at the 3% that the actual conversation on cultural safety actually started about. So we've got a lot of work and really trying to balance it out so that we're looking at increasing Indigenous nurses and midwives, as well as increasing the cultural safety of non-Indigenous nurses and midwives as well. So Katsun was founded in 1997. 1997 was when Katsun was founded, so we turned 25 years, so it's been a prime opportunity to reflect on Katsun. And Katsun was founded with the primary purpose of giving First Nations nurses and midwives being able to have a voice about improving health outcomes for our people. In 2002, there was a report, the Get Them and Keeping Them, that was released. The main aim of the Get Them and Keeping Them, and this was led under our inaugural CEO, Dr. Sally Gould, was to increase Indigenous nursing parity. So that was in 2002. That was 2 decades ago. And as of this year, our Indigenous registered nurses make up for 1.0% of the total registered nursing workforce. So we, in 2 decades, have not reached that. So we've got some big things that we need to be dealing with. The key element that I wanted to draw your attention to is that in 2012, I was the first then, and I'm hoping I'm not the last, Aboriginal registered nurse that completed a PhD that developed a model of excellence to increase Indigenous nurses in this country. Unfortunately, I see elements of the findings of my PhD and that model of excellence being cherry-picked rather than the whole model actually being implemented in schools of nursing and midwifery. And it was one of the reasons that I accepted the role as the CEO of this organisation, to be in a position to be able to lobby for the findings of a PhD to actually inform the way that forward as a country. So this is the getting them and keeping them. The recommendations that were made initially. We've just completed an evaluation of this, and the results of that evaluation will be released before the end of the year. But the recommendations that were made by our elders back in 2002 were very operational, and our aim going forward is to work out what are the system level changes that need to be made in order for those operational strategies to have more success than what they have historically. So again, just to reiterate, the getting them and keeping them was the primary purpose was to increase parity of Indigenous nurses in this country. And as of 2019, Indigenous registered nurses still only make up for 1.0% of Australia's nursing workforce. And also that CATS and AM only become N midwives, AM, in 2015. So this document in the beginning was very much only looking at registered nurses. So the exciting thing about midwifery and why I like working in midwifery, and if I ever done another degree, it's a Bachelor of Midwifery, is what I do, is when we look at the data that we're collecting now longitudinally around why midwifery getting higher scores pre and post an Indigenous health and cultural safety innovation, is that I've gone through and analysed the International Confederation of Midwifery philosophy of midwifery care, which I'm presenting to you on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, I've got the elements of what is First Peoples healthcare. And what you can see is a significant alignment between the philosophy of First Peoples healthcare. And to give you an example of a philosophy that does not align is at the moment when I look at my own profession, which is nursing, is that nursing is very biomedical driven. And they're not the models of care that and philosophies that are required to get outcomes for our communities. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to make this, this presentation will be recorded, and I'm happy to make the PowerPoint available for attendees as well. So towards the end of last year, we were successful in getting a fact sheet that's produced by, it's called the National Health Workforce Data Set. And historically, there's been a registered nurse, registered midwife, nurse practitioner, and an enrolled nurse fact sheet. And in 2019, we now have our own fact sheet for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives, which means that we can actually use the CATS and AM takes going forward.
So Roy,
so what you see on the left-hand side is
Roy, it's Yvette again. Sorry, you just buffered it out. You were just giving us, I think I don't know whether that's your internet, but can you just again go over the quick facts summary sheet again?
Yep. Turn my camera off, Yvette. Can you still see PowerPoint?
Yep, we can see the PowerPoint. That you're right. The camera being turned off might help a bit.
Beautiful. All right. So on the right-hand side, and again, I'll make this the link to this fact sheet available. We'll now get a fact sheet specifically on First Nations nurses produced in December of every year. What we know about the demographics of First Nations nurses and midwives, that on average we're actually, and we've also for. So really interesting. It's just froze a bit there, Yvette. I'm just
all right. Yeah, you're sort of buffeting in and out.
And that on, mate. And my presentation isn't moving.
Netta, have you
there.
got that sorted, Netta?
How's that? Yeah, I've got the slide. Can you see me?
No, so we can't see you and you're still buffeting.
Yvette, has that slide moved on?
No. Try again.
How's that? Can you see me now?
No. No. So
Can you
it's
hear
saying
me now, Yvette?
we can hear you. The notice that's come up is that your bandwidth is low.
Oh, well, what else to do?
All right. So has Netta got your PowerPoint?
Yep, she does.
I don't have it.
Yeah, I sent through this morning, Netta. It's gone through. So you can hear me now, Yvette. Are you happy for me to keep trying and going? Or
yep, keep going. Yep, keep going, Roy.
I'm not going to go fast because I'll make the presentation available. What I'm sharing with you here now is really important data, is that we only have 92 midwives only, First Nations midwives only in this country. We have 259 First Nations registered nurse and registered midwives, so dual registration, so only 351 Indigenous nurses and midwives in this country. So this is really low numbers. The sort of data that we don't have is what percentage of our First Nations midwives are credentialed, therefore able to be doing prescribing and private practice. So there are some data sets that are actually missing. But just demonstrating to you the need for more Indigenous nurses and midwives working in this first 2,000 days is absolutely critical. Now it's freezing on me a bit.
All right.
Sorry, guys.
That's okay. Look, let's keep going.
Yep.
And here we go. I think I appreciate everybody's patience, and we're doing the best we can. So, Roy, just keep ploughing on.
All right, beautiful. All right. So what the data set tells us, and just to give you guys some background with what we're dealing with, is in as far as our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander fact sheet goes on nursing and midwifery, it tells us that we've got 81 of us that are working in antenatal, intrapartum and postpartum care. Now this data absolutely needs to be cleaned up, and the more we get presented with it, the more we can actually guide the data guides on the sort of data that we actually require to be able to make the decisions. So we've got only 66 in this country that have declared that they're working in child and family health, 52 that are working in maternity care, 39 that are working in postnatal care, and you can see the numbers actually go down. So irrespective of how I present this data, you can see that the numbers are quite low. Increasing the numbers of Indigenous nurses and midwives coming into this area has to be a priority for all of us. The principal work setting is also critical for us to look at in the context of this work, is that we've got 230 First Nations nurses and midwives that are working in the Aboriginal health services across the country. This statistic here is very interesting for me, as I'm sure it is for you, in that we've got 16 group midwifery practice caseload First Nations midwives, only 16 in this country, which is a pretty dismal amount given the demand. Now these independent private practice 73 and other private practice 58, unfortunately I don't know what sits in behind that at this point, but we've sent off to actually ask what sits in behind this so that we're able to better have the data and potentially reach out and network all of these guys that are working in the same area. So there is some work that's happening nationally that is not happening in any other industry that gives us some great enablers. And in particular with the National Registration Accreditation Scheme, and the key organisation for us is the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia, in that we've got an accreditation standard in there that relates to working culturally safe. In 2018, we had a code of conduct that for the very first time identified white privilege and racism. At the moment, Katsanam is working on a 8-hour e-learning innovation called Murrumallangali, which is for practicing registered nurses and midwives, and that will be launched in March 2017 of 2022 for Close the Gap Week. And we're working with NMBA around the mandatory status of that program and how we don't make that our only strategy, but a suite of strategies right across education and training lifespan to make sure that we've got training going from the Cert 1, Cert 2, Cert 3, Cert 4, diploma, bachelor, all the way through to PhD, and not just, sort of sporadic reactive things to one element of that learning and training journey. What I did want to talk to you about is what we're doing, and what has really been missing in this agenda is that Katzenham was successful in hosting some money through both the Lowitja Institute and the Commonwealth to establish a national consortium of nursing and midwifery practitioners, researchers, educators, policymakers, funders and community organisations, and Professor Yvette Rowe is a part of that. And in a nutshell, it is really about ensuring that we've got data to inform the way that we move forward for the betterment of our communities. I won't go too much into that because I really want the opportunity to be able for people to be able to ask me any questions. There are two publications that I wanted to draw your attention to that have come out of Roianne. And just to show sort of the timeliness of Roianne is that we only had our first gathering in November of last year, and we've had 3 publications already from that consortium, really drawing a line in the sand, or I say throwing a spear in the sand around what our position is as Indigenous research leaders that are working researching in this area. And the metaphor of taking our blindfolds off was really a gift from an elder from the Tent Embassy fire, telling us, giving us a bit of a talking to around the privilege that we actually hold and how we use that privilege for the betterment of our communities. And it was a really profound experience that was shared through these publications. So this is who we've got involved in this at the moment. The independent researchers represent these universities. We really want to see not only all the universities represented, but anyone who's providing education and training, including the pathways into the Bachelor of Nursing and Midwifery. So RTO, private RTOs, as well as the TAFE sectors across the country. What I've included here is the recommendations from my PhD. There are recommendations both for education and for policy, and the recommendations for both of those areas have as much application relevance for today in 2021 as they did when they were made in 2012, and that will certainly be the agenda that Katzenham will be pushing, is that evidence-based strategies are used to increase the Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce. So going forward, much of what I spoke to throughout the presentation is that we need a multitude of approaches here, and not just operational ones, because we can continue to try and push Indigenous community members through Bachelors of Nursing and Midwifery or Diplomas of Nursing, but unless we're looking at the system and addressing the racism from both the academics and the system, that it's unethical and unsafe for us to continue to do that unless we've got strategies in place, including developing programs for Indigenous nursing and midwifery students and Indigenous nurses and midwives that are practicing to be able to deal with the racism that we're actually trying to address. So often we put a lot of strategies in place to increase the cultural safety of non-Indigenous nurses and midwives, and the reason we're doing that is because they exhibit intentionally or not racist behaviour and attitudes, and the people that are on the receiving end of that are Indigenous nursing and midwifery students and Indigenous nurses and midwives. So at the same time as building the capability of our non-Indigenous nurses and midwives, we have to also do that for our Indigenous nurses and midwives. So there's a lot of things that we need. We need more pathways into the Bachelor of Midwifery. We need more pathways from the Bachelor of Nursing and Midwifery into the Graduate Certificate of Child Health. And we need much better data to be able to support us to develop a strategy around this area. So what you can do, absolutely, please become a member of Katzenham. We've got 2,500 members of Katzenham at this point in time. 922 are First Nations voting, nurses and midwives that are voting, and we've got and that means it's only 25% of the 5,000 that are registering with AHPRA, so significantly lower than where we want to be. And we've got 676 student members that are also voting, but that's only 25% of the 2,500 First Nations nursing and midwifery students that we have within higher ed. We don't know the statistics of how many are coming through VET and the private RTOs. So we strongly encourage you as First Nations nurses and midwives, and also non-First Nations nurses and midwives, and even those that aren't nurses and midwives that are working in this area, to become members of KATSANAM so that we have a stronger voice to be able to lobby and advocate for our people. So in finishing, I wanted to share a short video with you. So I've come into the CEO role as of 1 year next week, and I've been really committed to ensuring that the centrality of culture in all the work that we do. And what I'm going to share with you now is a short video just to close that exemplifies KATSANAM's leadership as we're going forward. So just let me know, Yvette, if you can hear that, sis.
Just want to welcome you here on behalf of my mom, Gimawala, Yidinji people. Just like to say, Bilangaran Jundu, Bilangaran Jundunai, Bimbi, on behalf of my father, welcome you to the country. Bilangaran Jundunai, Yidinjalan, on behalf of Yidinji elders as well, welcome you here to the country. When we talk about being on country and actually living on country, I made a comment about the afterbirth, but we don't do it anymore. And my mum actually made a point of it that we should start putting our kids after birth back on country like we used to do.
On behalf of the Arikandi people who I represent here today, I'd like to welcome you onto my traditional country of Cairns.
Coming back to the fire was about privileging our leadership as Indigenous people, privileging our Indigenous ways in which we know things, the Indigenous ways in which we learn and the styles in which we lead. So coming back to the fire for me as an Aboriginal nurse leader was about responding to our community, which in the context of KATSANAM is responding to the voices of our members.
Coming back to the proper way of doing things. Our old people would have sat around fires and talked about the proper way and how we talk to each other, how we care for each other, how we care for country. That fire burns off those oppressive practices too. You know, we're using that as an analogy of doing the work of anti-racism, because that's a heat, that's a fire that is destructive.
It's embracing your blackness is what someone said to me. It's like really embracing who you are and standing up for what you believe in. Yeah.
Use all these deadly women and men around me to help build my spirit up again so that I can then take that out as well and use that with all my patients and have a better understanding.
Today when I sat in the conference, I was extremely emotional. I can't believe how deadly this conference is.
Coming back to the fire and working smarter was about us working collectively rather than as individuals, which is what is required within some institutions. And KATSANAM is adamant about leading with integrity and not making it rhetoric and actually doing what we're saying that we know is required.
I'm going to put the video back on, sis, and see if that works, just while I come into the... Hey, look out.
No, it did work, Roy. It worked.
It did?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
God, now I'm getting YouTube up. I'm just trying to get rid of it there. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right.
All right, beautiful. So I'm just wrapping up now, and my vision as an Aboriginal nursing leader is for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribe-bearing women to have the option of being supported by a known Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander midwife. And certainly in the last 15 years of my career, I'll be working tirelessly to ensure that our Indigenous midwifery workforce reflects not only the parity within the wider midwifery workforce, but the rate at which our women have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander midwives birthing Aboriginal babies the way it used to be. Thanks, Yvette.
Thank you very much, Professor Roianne West. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? First of all, we apologise for those technical glitches to you, Roy. So we've got some sort of plan Bs happening if it was going to happen again. So thank you so much for a passionate, thorough, thought-provoking presentation that really grounds us again. I think there are lots of things that remind us that in 2 decades we haven't moved so much. We haven't seen the sense of the workforce, but also we haven't seen a significant improvement in health outcomes for mothers and babies and families. So I remember Professor Puggy Hunter talked about Aboriginal health not just being a trophy that we bring down every so often and we shine it up and we talk about it and then we put it back because it's all a little bit too hard. Roianne's presented us with a challenge and she's also provided us with a roadmap to go forward. So thank you very much from that. I'll now open it up to participants to type in any questions or if they'd like to share a question. Just a couple of things from the feedback. Inspirational, Roy, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Brilliant, Roianne. There's a question here, I think, that you gave us so much information, and of all those priorities, Roy, if we could, if you were to say, look, these are the top 5 that I can do today, that's going to be our bang for buck, because everybody, we've got schools of nursing that are so stretched and midwifery that are so stretched that have got so many demands. Where do we need to focus our pointy end? Because people are going to say it's all too hard.
Yeah. I think for me, the pointy end is not around recruitment, but it's actually retaining not only with the number of Indigenous midwives and nurses that do finally endure the education system and graduate, but unfortunately the attrition rate once they get out the other side is higher than our non-Indigenous peers. So how do we build the capacity of those that are in there? Because if we're not consciously doing that, me and you be in leadership positions until we're old and grey and rickety. So this is a little bit selfish of me as well, as how to ensure that that we've got the ones that are coming through the system, that we support them adequately so that they, because if you pose to an Aboriginal nurse or midwife who's just graduated the possibility of becoming an academic, it's too late. They've run for the hills. They've had such a traumatic learning experience. We need to make sure that their experience within the university for the ones that are in there are much better. And I actually challenge, if we keep recruiting, trying to increase our numbers coming in, because they're already coming in at 300% the rate. So the data tells us that Indigenous nurses and midwives, that the commencement, our recruitment has increased 300%. Take your millions of dollars, you don't have to do a recruitment strategy, and actually use it on retaining and completing, and not even retaining. And the reason why my PhD focused on completions, because I knew lots of my brothers and sisters who'd started nursing and midwifery programs that were taken 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to get through. And that means time from their families, time from their community. So we have to work much harder at the systematic things and supporting those that are within the system, the education system, and those that are working clinically to keep them there delivering our babies. You're on mute, sis.
Yep. Yeah, one of the questions that you might want to tease out a bit, and I know there's some midwives and some nurses and non-clinicians on this presentation, is the thing about the nursing versus midwifery. And like you said, your heart and your training started with nursing, and you're saying, actually, when I look at midwifery, it's more inclusive, it's more mother and baby centered, we're getting better outcomes. How do we get people, because it's to some people, they're very loyal to their discipline. How do we get people to embrace?
Because when you work in this area, you're not loyal to your discipline, you're loyal to the people that you're serving. And the reason why the midwifery works well is what I was demonstrating is the philosophy of midwifery aligns better with Aboriginal health philosophy. That's why. So when you come in to work with Aboriginal mothers and babies, it's not your nursing or your midwifery philosophy, it's the philosophy of that community and those people that should transcend or supersede any of those other philosophies.
Here's a question from Professor Sue Krusky, and it's very much NT specific. There are many, where am I? Let me just bring this up. There are many unfilled position or roles for First Nation people in the Northern Territory. We need to lobby the NT Health to use the funding on traineeships, cadetships and sponsored positions. And we need to make our health services less racist so they can survive.
Yep. Look, one of the things that I notice is, and I've had the opportunity to meet with all of the chief nursing and midwifery officers around the country, and also the Commonwealth chief nursing and midwifery, the most obvious thing that is missing in this space is strategy. Everyone can rattle off a whole number of activities that needs to be done, but no one is bringing a strategy on how and when those strategies need to be deployed. And that is ultimately what missing. We don't run a health service, we don't run a country without a strategy or a plan, but everyone with their best intentions of wanting to improve things within this community does not bring strategy to their thinking. So we end up with a whole lot of little things being done, and we have now 4. So the Aboriginal education agenda started 50 years ago. 5 decades ago, my mother was standing in front of the first non-Aboriginal nurse and teaching about my people. So for 50 years, we've been doing that. If we took that 50 years and invested all of that money back into Aboriginal workforce, we wouldn't be in the predicament that we're in. So you need strategy. Like, these throwaway, we need this, this, and this needs to come with a strategy. Every state and territory needs a strategy, and the country needs a strategy on how to do this, because we're clearly not getting it.
Thanks, Roianne. In your presentation, you said a couple of words that I know people sort of get a little bit sensitive about and a little bit uncomfortable and thinking, well, it's not me, it's someone else. And that were the words of racism and white privilege. How does at a college level, and you said, look, actually, we need to be addressing system level, college level, teaching level, student level. How do we have these courageous conversations? Where does that leadership need to come from?
Yeah, look, non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery leadership is, absolutely pivotal alongside Indigenous nursing and midwifery leadership, particularly if you look at the numbers. If we only make up for 1.3% of the nursing and midwifery workforce, you could count on 2 hands how many Indigenous nurses and midwifery leaders we have in this country. So you need non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery leaders, and the conversations need to be much more relationship-based. So racism and white privilege isn't about an individual, that's about a product of colonialism. So when you're talking about these sorts of concepts, they need to be put in context. They're just not as simple as that, and I certainly understand the sensitivities when they're words that are thrown around when people don't fully understand what they are. And the impact not only in Australia, and you would be naive if you were an Australian and you didn't think that you exhibited some form of racism. That would be naive, because this country was built on racism. So, and that's the truth-telling aspect that needs to happen. A presentation I presented a couple of weeks ago for University of Sydney on the World Day of Indigenous Peoples was actually challenging nursing and midwifery in this country to dismantle its social contract. So its social contract of when nursing started way back when, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't part of that contract. So what we're trying to do now is bolt on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge. And what we've got to work out as nursing and midwifery leaders, that's a massive task. That's a massive undertaking to dismantle and remantle nursing and midwifery. So everyone sort of freaks out and goes, oh my God, that's not possible. And it absolutely isn't within this generation. It's not possible within my generation, but I know that my legacy is I want to have moved closer to that through my leadership than when I hand it over to my twins. And their job is to move that agenda forward than when they hand that over to my grandchildren. That's what nursing and midwifery have to lead us, is what's their bit that they do in their leadership role, and what is their legacy, not only to Aboriginal health, but what is their legacy to nursing and midwifery in this country? Because if you look at nursing and midwifery in this country at this point in time, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not in it. That's the long and short of it. We are not in that conversation at this point in time. And unless we get more people engaged with CATSNM, so as a CEO, we got 25% of 5,000 First Nations nurses and midwives in this organisation. We are the peak advocacy body, and I cannot confidently lobby at a national level if only 1,000 of the 5,000 First Nations nurses and midwives are in this organisation. Imagine if we had 5,000 First Nations nurses and midwives, as well as the 2,500 First Nations student nurses and midwives, the calibre or the possibility or the influence that we would genuinely have over nursing and midwifery in this country.
Thanks, Roy. I've got a question here from Wendy McIntosh. And so I know it's something that you're very passionate on two fronts. My background is mental health in the terms of postnatal depression and other mental illnesses that have occurred during pregnancy and post care. Can you please comment on how Birthing on Country may assist in this area?
That's probably a question for you, but just to say that when I'm talking about Aboriginal health, I'm not talking about the biomedical understanding of Aboriginal health. I'm talking about the definition of Aboriginal health that was defined by our leaders in the National Aboriginal Health Strategy in 1989, which is the social, emotional, cultural, spiritual and political well-being of the whole community. And that encapsulates mental health. So if you get all of those bits right, that's the model. That's what you need to be working to. And mental health is a part of that. Social, emotional well-being is a part of that. And Yvette, I have no doubt, given the evidence that you guys are producing now on the benefits of birthing on country, that the trajectory around postnatal depression and mental illness going forward is addressed, eliminated, reduced.
I think that, as advocates, as strivers between trying to redesign models that are mother and centred care and return to communities and things like that, you make a really important thing. What is measured gets managed. And you were talking about, well, unless we know these numbers, we're sort of going blind. But again, when we talk about health and well-being, we're talking about, are we collecting this data? Can we present it really well? So we know there's numerous benefits for birthing on country and mother-centred care, and we've just got to get those numbers. I've just got again, from probably a college perspective, got a question here from Claire Davison. What can we do as midwifery academics to support students? And you might want to link that to the driving work of Mullion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the practical level, it's about becoming, connecting in with other academics, Indigenous academics and non-Indigenous academics in this space. But the number one thing you can do is the work on yourself. Is often there's an expectation that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I need them to help me, but really cultural safety, and there's been a massive paradigm shift between, and that terminology has changed. So in the early 1980s and 90s, it was about cultural awareness and very much about my people standing in front of non-Indigenous health professionals teaching you all about us. And the agenda has really now shifted to cultural safety. We're actually teaching you about you. What are the values, the assumptions and the biases that you have formed based on being a product of this country? How has Australia's colonial history informed your values and your beliefs about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? In particular, how does that impact on the way in which you care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? You don't need me to do that. You don't need any of us to do that. That's work you can actually take on for yourself. And when I talk about numbers, what I know in this country is that we've got 10,000 nursing and midwifery educators. We have 111 Indigenous nursing and midwifery educators. So that's one of us to 100 of you. That's not our responsibility. So there has to be a lot of individual responsibility. If you're serious about going on this journey, if you're serious about being a nursing and or midwifery educator or working within Australia's healthcare system, this is unavoidable, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the responsibility first and foremost has to come back onto you to make a decision, to unlearn what you've learned and then relearn it based on truth, but also connecting in with other Indigenous and non-Indigenous nurses, academics from across the country that are working in the same area.
Thank you so much for that. In light of your strategy that we need to, embrace midwives, they've got a role, they're growing. Sue Kildare writes a comment that it's very incredibly disappointing that to see universities around the country dropping the BMid and going back to a double degree and postgrad midwifery. How do we push back on that?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I'm not a midwife, but from what I'm seeing in the data around what we're doing in Aboriginal health, it's the philosophy of midwifery that should be informing the way we do the Bachelor of Nursing. And even if we have people that are coming through doing the Bachelor of Nursing, going on to do the grad cert child and family health or immunisation, they've still been indoctrinated into a particular way of thinking that they have to unlearn in order to be able to successfully work in this context. And that, for me, was one of the most profound things about the Australian Nurse Family Partnership Program, is that program was built on nurses from overseas that were public health trained in their undergraduate. Our nurses in this country are not public health trained in their undergraduate. So taking an Australian nurse and putting them within a context where it's about population and public health has the risk of doing more damage, not only to the work, but also to that professional, because they're going in with the wrong mindset. So there needs to be a massive shift in the way that we do nursing and midwifery education. And Sue, I'm probably thinking that you need a couple of key universities that do the BMid so that they do it properly. Because if you spread it too thin, you guys don't have big numbers either. Your plight is very similar to ours, is that you want a couple of midwifery students that are doing it great rather than 39 that are 38 that are shitty and shouldn't be doing it anyway. And I've seen both.
Roy, I'm going to slowly bring this to a close. I just want to reiterate some of the key points that Roy has challenged us this morning to consider. One is that she said up front, she said quite clearly the shoulders that she stands on, the legacy that she is articulating, and the vision she's put forward. She's made that challenge very clear. She talked about understanding where our professions come from and what we're trying to do, and not to get sidetracked on these little minutiae, rather using a whole multitude of strategies, not little activities, big strategies, bold strategies. When we talk about the workforce, there's an opportunity, but we've been having this conversation for a long time. Let's not get this, this exhaustion. Let's actually do some work around it. Attaching it to closing the gap. Well, it's actually closing the chasm. This is a huge thing. And we know that midwifery and nursing are critical to that frontline workforce. Again, measuring what matters gets managed. So are we collecting the right data? We've got a better insight into the First Nation workforce. How do you become an ally? Roy's giving you some really clear strategies. Again, as I said when I introduced Roy, she is fierce, she's a leader, she will stand on principles, she will make no excuses for the fight that she's putting forward. So I'd like everybody to turn their camera on, and let's give Roy a congratulations by waving her hand, saying thank you very much. Thank you so much, Roy. Really appreciate your time. If there are any questions, please email it to Kayla or to myself, and we'll forward on to Roy. But thank you so much for your time this morning. Take care.
Take care, everybody, and keep up the great work.